Ladies and gentlemen, this is the big one, the granddaddy of them all, the Rose Bowl. Michigan versus Alabama. I don't have a big, long, fancy intro. I just want to get right into it. So, with the intro out of the way, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the JSA Studio. I'm your host, as always, Nathan, and today we're going to be talking about the big one, Alabama versus Michigan. Starting off with the quarterbacks here, we of course have Jalen Milroe for Alabama and J.J. McCarthy for Michigan. If you're unaware of the format of these videos, we go position by position and talk about each team at that position. We then move on to discussing the matchups before we maybe talk about some narratives and outside things a little bit, and then finally move into the prediction. So let's go ahead and start with Jalen Milroe. And I think there is some misconceptions about him and his style of play. I think a lot of people get his arm right, or him when he's throwing the football right. And that's that he's extraordinarily good at throwing the deep ball and pretty good at throwing in the quick game or in short distances, where while he struggles somewhat in the intermediate range. I shouldn't have said somewhat. He struggles in the intermediate. But luckily for him, their offensive coordinator, Tommy Rees, at least understands that he's not good at it and almost never calls those kinds of concepts, especially in the second half of the season. Where I think people get it wrong on Jalen Milroe is that if I had to guess, I would probably say half of his rushing production is on designed runs rather than just scrambling. In fact, especially early on in the year, he has gotten better at it, but a major reason why they were giving up a lot of sacks was because Jalen Milroe didn't move around in the pocket. Because Jalen Milroe is going through something that a lot of athletic quarterbacks go through. They don't want to be labeled as just scramblers or a running quarterback and all that comes with that connotation, so they try to force themselves to sit into the pocket and make reads and stand in there and throw the football to the detriment of their team. Now, as I said, he has gotten significantly better at that as the season has gone on. You could see it against Georgia and you could see it against Auburn. Also, like a young quarterback, Jalen Milroe is significantly worse, like beyond just the expected drop-off. He is significantly worse even beyond that when he is under pressure and when he is blitzed. I think right now, at least, he does struggle a little bit with his processing ability, not necessarily in terms of making reads and knowing where to go with the ball, but in terms of, oh, that guy blitzed, what does that mean? And how should I react to that? Do I go to my hot read? Do I trust my offensive line? Do I do something else? Do I try to scramble? I feel like there are at times this year where you can see him going through that thought process in his head for a second before remembering what he should do and then trying to do it, but it's usually too late. And I will say, against Georgia, there was a lot less of that. However, that was a significant problem against Auburn and has been consistently a problem throughout the year. But again, I've already kind of touched on this. I'm not sure how much we can actually take away from the Georgia game for Alabama, because Georgia played horribly in that game, and the coaching staff absolutely shit themselves. Now, Alabama was going to win that game one way or another. I truly believe that. I don't think there's a scenario where Georgia wins that game on that day. But let's be real, okay? Georgia played like a C- football game that day. I will also say this. That was not as close of a game as the score tells you that it was. Georgia scored late, and then Alabama got the ball back, got a few first downs, and won the game. Had the score been tied, had Georgia made that field goal that they missed, that drive would have played out exactly the same, and Alabama just would have ended up kicking a field goal instead of kneeling the clock out to win the game. But Alabama, I think really for the first time since Kentucky, put it all together. And I do believe that a large part of that was because they finally were a little bit healthy. They had everything together, so to say. However, Jalen Milroe did not kill Georgia through the air. He didn't, in all honesty, have all that great of a game throwing the football. Now, he had that one connection with Jermaine Burton, which they're going to get in this game. I can tell you right now, Michigan people, they're going to get that one deep shot to Jermaine Burton. There is nothing that is going to stop that from happening. The thing that is really concerning about Jalen Milroe is that even in their best games offensively, he's not particularly efficient throwing the football. And this matchup against this Michigan defense, which is the best defense beyond a shadow of a doubt that he's played, is talented enough to make him try to throw the football in ways that he has not been very effective doing it. So that is going to be the story of this game to me. If you're looking for an important thing for Alabama, for whatever reason, it really seems like most people are defaulting to Alabama is going to win this game. But if you're looking for a tell in terms of after the first few drives of the game, you kind of know who's going to win based on how the team's playing, it's going to be Jalen Milroe throwing the football. If he can come out and throw the football and consistently look really, really good, they're going to win this game by a significant margin. The problem is he has not put together an entire game of football where he's been consistent the entire year. Even against LSU, he wasn't particularly as efficient as other quarterbacks were throwing the football. Now, he was a menace running the ball, okay? I understand that. But if we were to look at games where he's played defenses that have the ability to deal with him somewhat athletically, the running game really hasn't been there for him. Now, in those games, he has, for the most part, responded by throwing the football. So he's done pretty much everything that anybody reasonably could ask him to do. However, in those games that I'm talking about here, where he's played defenses that have been able to keep up with him athletically, well, if you want some examples to look at, that's Texas, Texas A&M, and Tennessee for the most part, and Georgia. Texas A&M was probably his best game as a thrower because they really, really had to throw the football in that game, and he responded. But he wasn't great. Like, he was good enough to win the game, but there's reason that that game was still close. And there was a reason that if the defense doesn't get a touchdown, that's a single-digit game against Tennessee. There's a reason that Georgia was a single-digit game. And it's because Jalen Milroe, down to down, is maybe the most inconsistent big-time quarterback in the country. And he does kind of throw the ball up for grabs a little bit. And he does flat out and straight up miss a lot of open receivers a lot of the time. And when he's under pressure, that gets exemplified even worse. However, I've seen him maybe 5 or 6 times this year just airmail a ball even when he has a clean pocket. So that's kind of the book on Jalen Milroe. He's absolutely spectacular, but he's also extraordinarily bad. But he's also really, really good. I don't know. He's very inconsistent. And depending upon when he makes his mistakes, because he's going to make mistakes in this game, depending upon when and how bad the mistakes are, is going to be maybe the most important factor in determining who wins this game. I don't necessarily think it's J.J. McCarthy that is the most important player in terms of deciding who is going to win this game. I think it's Jalen Milroe. If Jalen Milroe makes those mistakes at crucial points in time, or if those mistakes take opportunities out of the Alabama offense's hands, i.e. through turnovers, then I think Michigan wins the game. Pretty easily, to be honest with you. I think if Jalen Milroe throws 2 interceptions, I think this game might get out of hand in favor of Michigan. Because the way that these two teams play football in general plays into each other's strengths. Both of these teams want to run the football and limit opposing possessions. So there's a very real possibility that Alabama is only going to get 9 possessions this game. So if you turn the ball over on 2 of those possessions, then all of a sudden you really only have 7 or 8 possessions to try to score. And generally speaking, unless you're an elite offense, you're probably only going to score about 50% of the time in those types of games. And against Michigan's defense, maybe even less than that. So you're talking about maybe 3 scoring drives in this game. And if that happens, you're not winning the game. So Jalen Milroe not turning the ball over is going to be, I think, the biggest thing in this game. If he turns the ball over, then I think Michigan is going to win the game. If he doesn't turn the ball over, then I think Alabama is going to win the game. And it's not like Jalen Milroe's been particularly bad at turning the ball over. He has 6 interceptions and a few fumbles, but I think it has more to do with the fact that Michigan is maybe the best. If they aren't the best, then they are the second best team in the country at creating turnovers. And not just capitalizing on mistakes, but actually creating turnovers. If they aren't the best, then it's Iowa. If you want to say Iowa is the best, I'm perfectly fine with that. Also, Jalen Milroe isn't the only player that could turn the ball over, but I do think he is probably the one that is the most likely to produce those turnovers, in my opinion. Moving on to J.J. McCarthy, finally. J.J. McCarthy, I think, is maybe one of the most misunderstood players in all of college football. He is not an elite quarterback. He just isn't. What he is an extraordinarily efficient quarterback that outside of 2 games this year does not make mistakes. Flat out and straight up. Of his 10 turnover-worthy plays this year, 7 of them came against Maryland and Bowling Green. Outside of those 2 games, he has very rarely made a mistake or put the ball up into harm's way. And I will also say that one of his 3 remaining turnover-worthy plays came against Penn State on a play where he got absolutely obliterated by Adisa Isaac around the tackle, and the ball went right into the linebacker's hands, who dropped it. So that one was affected by the pressure. So what I think is a fair criticism of J.J. McCarthy is that Michigan, outside of the TCU game last year, never asked him to throw the football to win a football game. He has never been asked to do that. And I'm not sure he can, because why wouldn't they ask him to do it when they should have, probably, in my opinion? I don't know the answer to that question. But I do know that if he does have to throw the football to win this game, that is an extraordinary advantage for Alabama. What I don't think is a fair criticism of J.J. McCarthy is, for example, the Penn State game or the Iowa game or maybe even the Maryland game. And using those takes against him is a bit nonsensical and, in all honesty, a bad faith argument. A, because J.J. McCarthy was playing with a low ankle sprain against Maryland and Ohio State and Iowa. But B, he was not asked to do anything, really, in those games. Like, against Penn State, they said, Penn State can't score on us. We have the lead. We are not going to risk maybe turning the ball over at all, and we're just going to run the football because we understand that we'll be able to break a play or 2 here or there, maybe put up some more points, and win the game by the fact that Penn State's offense sucks balls. Let's not mince words here, okay? J.J. McCarthy was 7 for 8 for 60 yards against Penn State. He was probably going to have, if we were to expedite that out to 28 pass attempts, which is around what his average is per game, he probably would have had a normal J.J. McCarthy game where he would have had 24 pass attempts for 190 yards and a touchdown. Michigan just said Penn State is too good at creating turnovers in the passing game, so we're not going to risk them doing that, even though we do probably have confidence that our quarterback can make those throws. And the reason why I say they have confidence that their quarterback can make those throws is because against Iowa and Ohio State, they let him make those throws. One last thing about J.J. McCarthy is that the national media do not understand how Michigan operates at even a fundamental level on the offensive side of the football. There is a very, very small chance that this game is going to be put on J.J. McCarthy's shoulders. Michigan's entire MO, their entire offense, is built to not have their quarterback decide how good they are. And more so even than that, just a stylistic matchup between these two teams, I don't think how good J.J. McCarthy is really going to be a factor in this game. Because as we transition here into the running backs, and by extension the running game conversation, I think Michigan is going to be able to run the football relatively well. However, before I do that, I do have to decide a winner between these two quarterbacks, and to me it's pretty obvious. Even though he's been up and down, I'm taking Jalen Milroe over J.J. McCarthy any day of the week. Running backs. This is an interesting conversation, mainly because both of these running back rooms have been extraordinarily underwhelming so far this year. Jase McClellan has been solid. Blake Corum has been okay. Both of these players are significant downgrades from what these teams had last year. And because of that, neither of these offenses are as potent, and neither of these running games are as potent as they were last year. Michigan has all but destroyed their running back rotation. It's pretty much just been Blake Corum the entire year. Part of that is because Donovan Edwards has not been playing well, but I think it has more to do with the fact that they know the run game isn't as good as it was last year, and Blake Corum, because of his one-cut running back style of play, does give them a better chance to be more consistent in the running game than Donovan Edwards. As far as Alabama goes, Rondell Williams and Jase McClellan have been the main two backs. There have been some other ones in there. Neither one of them are particularly good, in my opinion, and I do think Alabama is going to have a harder time running the football against Michigan than they did against Georgia, mainly because I think Michigan's defensive line is better than Georgia's defensive line. And also, to be entirely honest with you, the running backs for Alabama should not be a factor in this game. They should be non-existent. If you run the ball more than 20 times to your running backs, I have to seriously question what you're doing in this game. Because every time Jalen Milroe turns around and hands the ball off to a running back, it is a massive W for Michigan. Because that's their game, attacking downhill against the traditional running game. That's what they do. They're really, really good at it. I also need to clear up some lies that are being stated about this Alabama run defense. If you take out the 300 some odd yards that Auburn ran on them, this is a top 15 run defense in the country, okay? They had one bad game. And against Tennessee, they had the one big play and then were completely dominant. So this is still a tremendous run defense, okay? However, when teams have lined up to run the football with the quarterback or by running some trap or pull concepts, they have been able to get chunk plays on this defense. It's really been against zone defense, which used to be the weakness for Saban-esque defenses, that the Alabama defense has been dominant. Well, Michigan doesn't run a whole lot of zone, A, and B, they have the capabilities to have a very effective quarterback run game as well. Not so much with J.J. McCarthy. I don't think they really want him to run the football at all. Early on in the year, they didn't run the football with him because they didn't want to risk him getting hurt. And later on in the year, he was hurt, so they didn't run the ball with him. I'm not convinced that they're going to run the ball with him in this game here. And the reason that I want to talk about this is because I think Michigan has a secret running back weapon. It just so happens that he plays the quarterback position, and his name is Alex Orji. I think Michigan is at least going to try to do what Auburn did to this team. which is with the sort of outside power run, but with the quarterback, like a QB sweep sort of play. But they're not going to do it with J.J. McCarthy. They're going to do it with Alex Orji. And in the 2 games that have mattered so far this season, we have seen Alex Orji in one of them against Ohio State. And he was pretty effective. So I think there is a high probability that we see Alex Orji quite a bit in this football game. I also think there's a high probability that off of that, you also see Alex Orji throw the football and maybe get a big play. I'm not sure. But I do think we're going to see Alex Orji come off of the bench and have Michigan run the ball that way. And even against Auburn, where Peyton Thorne, I think, completed 5 passes the entire game, and they were just lining up to run the football, and pretty much everybody knew that they were going to run the football, they still managed to run the football. Now, against pretty much everybody else, they haven't been able to do that. However, against pretty much everybody else, the exception being LSU, who, again, LSU ran the ball on them very effectively. However, those are really the only 2 teams that even really tried to run the quarterback on them, and they both had success. Now, only 1 or 2 of those teams even had the capability of trying to run the quarterback, and for whatever reason, they just didn't particularly. I think Jackson Dart was hurt, and Arkansas sucks, so they didn't really try to run the football in that manner. So, and those were the 2 teams that I was talking about where they kind of had the capability of doing it. Everybody else, they have not had the capability of doing it. Michigan does have the capability of utilizing both the traditional run game in what I think is going to be more effective than people want to admit, and also the quarterback run game. So when it comes to the run game here, and the running backs specifically, when we're talking about the roster here, I'm going to give Michigan the edge here in terms of the run game and the running back position. Skill positions. This is going to be a quick segment. Alabama is better. It's not a conversation. Michigan has one of the worst skill positions in the Power 5. And if they didn't have Colston Loveland, they straight up might have the worst group of skill position players in the Power 5. Now, I do think they have some promising-ish young talent, but they are extraordinarily unproven, and they're sort of starting for guys are not all that good. I think Colston Loveland is the only one that really has a shot of getting drafted on day 2 or better. Meanwhile, Alabama has Jermaine Burton, who single-handedly means that they have a better receiving group than Michigan. Nye Black is an effective tight end. Bond is a solid receiver as well. Bond, if he played for Michigan, would be Michigan's best wide receiver by a country mile. And I don't think there is a Michigan wide receiver, even Roman Wilson, that would be on the 2 deep for Alabama. So Alabama does, in fact, have the advantage at these skill positions in terms of talent, at least. Now, I want to make something very clear here. Alabama's skill position group is by no means a good one. I think they're slightly above average at the Power 5 level. Jermaine Burton is their best wide receiver, and he is good, not great. But he's still significantly better than anybody Michigan has. Moving on to the offensive lines, now we're starting to get into the bread and butter of these 2 teams here. A lot has been made about Alabama's offensive line struggles so far this year. And I will say, even though the offensive line has kind of struggled this year at times, I don't really think it's 100% or even, I think maybe the majority, the offensive line's fault. I think a lot of the time it's been Jalen Milroe kind of refusing to move around in the pocket. However, Caden Proctor has been a liability for stretches this year. Now, against Auburn and Georgia, he was not. In fact, he was very good in those games. I'm not sure if that's him turning a corner and figuring it out now, because he is a true freshman, or if it's the fact that neither Auburn or Georgia really has even an average pass rusher on their team from the outside. I think it's likely a mixture of both. I do think Caden Proctor has gotten better, but I think that he is still not that good, and a weakness that could be exploited. Now, Michigan had a liability on their offensive line as well. His name was Carson Barnhart, and he played left tackle and right tackle. Now, he was better at right tackle than he was at left tackle. However, Bro got absolutely embarrassed by Penn State. However, he's not there anymore. He's playing right guard with the injury to Zach Zinner. So, I think really here, the only two spots where there are liabilities heading into this game were Alabama left tackle and Michigan right tackle. And I think Trent Tate Jones is significantly better than Carson Barnhart. Michigan has been really weird about playing their offensive linemen. Early on in this year, they started Carson Barnhart left tackle, and he sucked dick against group of 5 teams. And they started Miles Hinton at right tackle, which made no sense because he's played left tackle his entire career. And then when you put him at left tackle, Miles Hinton actually looks pretty good. And when you put him at right tackle, Carson Barnhart, where he played right tackle the majority of last year, actually looks decent as well. But then Miles Hinton had a bad game, and they bring in Ladarius Henderson. And Ladarius Henderson, even though he's really a guard playing left tackle, has been very good this year. In fact, he really didn't get beat against Penn State. It was Adisa Isaac and Chop Robinson that destroyed Carson Barnhart on the right side, not the left side. So Ladarius Henderson has actually been pretty good at left tackle. So when it comes to left tackles, I would give the edge to Michigan. Now, moving into the guard positions here. At the guard positions for Alabama, they have Jaden Roberts and Tyler Booker. I think both of those guards are better than Michigan's current guards. If Zach Zinter was healthy, I think Zach Zinter would be the best guard between these two teams. He's not healthy. He broke his leg. So I think Alabama has the two best guards. So left guard and right guard, I'm going to give the advantage to Alabama. Even though I don't think that Carson Barnhart at right guard will be as big of a drop-off as I think some people might anticipate. I think Carson Barnhart as a guard is actually a pretty good, maybe even great offensive lineman. And I also think Michigan gets significantly better at right tackle with Trent Tate Jones, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Moving inside to center. For Alabama, they have McLaughlin, and for Michigan, they have Drake Nugent. McLaughlin has not been good. He's been consistently your second worst offensive lineman this year for Alabama. And I think, in all honesty, he's probably the second worst offensive lineman, just ahead of Caden Proctor, who, as I've said, might have turned the corner, and just behind Carson Barnhart. However, I do think that is a little bit of a conversation. But needless to say, I think Drake Nugent is significantly better than McLaughlin at the center position. Now, moving on to right tackle, even though I think Trent Tate Jones, and you can go back in time and look at my Michigan offensive line video from this offseason, I have consistently maintained that Trent Tate Jones is the best tackle on this football team. I think Trent Tate Jones is really, really, really good. And I think he actually makes the Michigan offensive line better by being on the field. However, J.C. Latham is a first-round top 20 caliber pick. Trent Tate Jones is not that. So at right tackle, the advantage goes to Alabama, and the overall advantage also goes to Alabama. Now, had Zach Zinter been healthy, Michigan would have had a better offensive line, in my opinion. But considering that we don't exactly know what Carson Barnhart is going to look like as a guard, we know that he was a liability in the pass game as a tackle, but that does get mitigated because what he really struggled against was speed rushers around the corner, and that is not something that he's going to face inside. So I actually think that he will be much better as a guard than a tackle, and I think the drop off between him and Zach Zinter, while still noticeable, won't be this massive chasm. But overall, I think Alabama has the better offensive line. Moving on to the defensive line groups for these two teams. This is the strength of Michigan's team as a whole. They legitimately have 9 players that they can play comfortably along the defensive line. And for those of you that want to hark on Michigan's talent level and want to talk about how Alabama just has so much more talent than Michigan, no. I think Michigan has 4 defensive linemen that all have first round potential. Not necessarily that they're going to get drafted in the first round, because 3 of them aren't even draft eligible this year, but I think they have serious first round, legit first round, even at that, like top 20 pick potential. Like Kenneth Grant, the man on your screen, is an absolute freak of nature. He is maybe a slightly less athletic Jordan Davis. I think Mason Graham, a 6'4", 320-pound defensive tackle that can play the nose or the 3 technique and rushes the passer at an advanced level, is also someone who could be a first-round pick. I think Derek Moore, who has somewhat had a breakout season so far this year and has consistently gotten pressure throughout the whole season, could also potentially be someone who could be talked about in the first round, provided he has the opportunity. And beyond that, Michigan has several other defensive linemen that are almost certainly going to get drafted. Jalen Harrell and Josiah Stewart both have day 2 pick potential, in my opinion. I think Cam Good is someone who has a decent chance to get drafted. I think Rayshawn Benny, if he returns, has a decent chance to get drafted in 2025. And Braden McGregor has the type of build and athletic profile that teams take a chance on in the 6th or 7th round. So I think he's got a good chance to get drafted as well. So Michigan quite literally goes 9 deep along the defensive line. Now, for Alabama, they have significantly less depth along their defensive line group as Michigan does. However, they have the best 2 defensive linemen right now of the 2 groups combined, and that's Dallas Turner and Chris Broswell. Chris Broswell and Dallas Turner are both spectacular in the passing game. Dallas Turner is probably going to be a top 20 pick. I have him currently graded as a top 20 pick. Chris Broswell, I have currently graded as a top 50 pick because he's not as good of a run defender as Dallas Turner is. And Dallas Turner isn't a great run defender. He's solid. Like, he's not a liability by any stretch of the means, but it doesn't make as many plays in the run game as perhaps you would anticipate. However, he's a fantastic athlete, and I really, really, really like Dallas Turner. But where it starts to get a little bit sketchy is along the inside, with Tim Keenan, Tim Smith, and Jaheim Otis being the main 3 that you see rotating in along the interior for Alabama. None of those guys are good. They're not. They're solid run defenders, and they do their job good enough for their linebackers to clean up and absolutely be very, very, very good in the run game. However, none of those guys are really NFL players, in my opinion, or at least not right now. Keenan and Otis are both sophomores. I think they're both true sophomores. I'm not positive on that, but they're both younger guys. I don't think they're draft eligible, and they could absolutely get better into the future. However, right now, I don't think they're NFL guys, and they provide very little in the passing game. Keenan has been their best interior pass rusher, but he's really not a whole lot more than a pocket pusher, and I think that the interior defensive line here is a pretty big weakness for Alabama. So overall, as a unit, I do think Michigan has a much better defensive line unit, even though Alabama has 2 studs on the edges. And just so I am a bit clear here, I don't necessarily think there's a significant drop-off between Alabama's edge rushers and Michigan's edge rushers. Like, I think Derek Moore has the potential to be a first-round pick, too. And I think Josiah Stewart is a early day 2 pick. And I think Jalen Harrell is also a day 2 pick as well. So I think Michigan has 3, maybe 4 better than day 2 or day 2 selections along the edge group rotation, along with another guy who I think has a decent chance to get drafted in Braden McGregor. So I think this is pretty obviously an advantage for Michigan along the defensive line. Moving on to what might be the most contentious discussion we're going to have in this video here, the linebackers between Alabama and Michigan. For the most part, I'm going to be talking about these two units as Campbell and Lawson for Alabama and Barrett and Colson for Michigan. And this is another one where I think there's a pretty clear advantage for one team. When we're talking about Alabama, Deontay Lawson and Jihad Campbell are kind of the opposites of each other. Campbell is actually pretty good in coverage. However, for whatever reason, he just doesn't read the run game as well as you would expect an Alabama linebacker to read the run game. Whereas Deontay Lawson, at times this year, has straight up been a liability in coverage, but he's been absolutely incredible in the run game. Like, genuinely one of the best run defending linebackers when healthy in the entire country. However, as good as he's been in the run game, he's been as bad in the pass game. He's straight up a liability when he's dropped into coverage, which is why they actually blitz him a whole lot, which he's very good at doing. And for Michigan, Mike Barrett, a sixth-year senior, has broken out this year in a spectacular fashion. He's been absolutely incredible, but specifically, he's been very, very good as a coverage linebacker. And he's a very good athlete for the position. So hypothetically, he would probably be the person that would be assigned to spying Jalen Milroe in more obvious sort of passing situations. And Junior Colson, who I believe will be a day 2 pick this year, even though he isn't playing at 100%, as he is going to have a cast on both of his hands, he has been very, very good this year, and he is a tremendous athlete for the position as well. Michigan has speed at the second level, and legitimate speed at the second level, and they also have two linebackers that are pretty good in coverage, with a third one that they can bring off the bench who's also pretty good in coverage. In other words, I think Michigan has two linebackers that can play the run very well and the pass very well, and I think Alabama has a linebacker who's very good against the run and a liability against the pass, and a linebacker who's very good against the pass and not very good against the run. So I think Michigan has the better linebacking core as well. But I want to make this very clear. If Deontay Lawson can figure it out in the pass game and use that ridiculous level of athleticism that he has to actually be able to cover people, he's going to be a top 10 pick in the NFL. He's that good. He has that level of talent in him. And he's still a young player. So he does have the time to be able to learn and get better. But right now, for all of the games that he's played in this year, he has been hurt a little bit. He hasn't been that good in coverage and has, for stretches, been straight up a liability. The final position group that I'm going to talk about today is going to be the defensive backs. And we're going to go ahead and go with position by position for the DBs here. So we're going to talk about the two outside corners. We're going to move into the slot. Then we're going to talk about free safety and strong safety. Starting with the outside corners, this is a fairly easy decision, even though I think Michigan might have the second best corner duo in the country in Will Johnson and Josh Wallace. I think Josh Wallace is someone who could go late day 2, if not probably early day 3, and has been consistently spectacular this year for Michigan. He's been, in terms of consistency, the best cover corner for Michigan. Will Johnson, on the other hand, the comparison I use for him is Darius Slay. So when he's going up against an elite caliber wide receiver, he shows up and he plays really, really well. However, he kind of has lapses in concentration, or he just thinks he's so much better than the other player. Then he does kind of get beat by lesser wide receivers fairly consistently. And that's exactly what Darius Slay, for the vast majority of his career, has done. Now, I think Will Johnson has top 10 pick as a corner in his upside. However, Terrion Arnold and Kool-Aid McKinstry are both top 20 selections in this upcoming draft class and have a very good chance to end up being my CB1 and CB2. They are, in my opinion, cornerback 1 for Terrion Arnold and cornerback 3 for Kool-Aid McKinstry in all of college football this year. Cornerback 2 would have been Cooper DeJean, but he's hurt. I think Will Johnson, when he's on his A game, is probably top 5. And I think Josh Wallace probably would be somewhere in the top 20 range in terms of all of the corners in all of college football. But when it comes to the outside cornerback position, Alabama has the advantage there pretty obviously. Moving into the slot, I think it's pretty much the same story, but opposite. I think Mike Sandersill is the best slot corner in the country by a significant margin. I think Malachi Moore is probably top 10, although he does have some flaws that are relatively easily exploited. However, he's still a very, very good player. Mike Sandersill is, I think, probably a day 2 pick. I think the NFL is going to look at him in a very similar manner that they looked at Brian Branch last year for this Alabama team. And I think that even though he is, in my opinion, a better athlete than Brian Branch, he doesn't have the size that Brian Branch has, so I think that kind of cancels each other out. He's going to go to a zone-heavy team at the next level and be one of the steals of the draft. Moving on to strong safety, I think both of these are the weakest positions in the secondary for their respective teams. So Jalen Key for Alabama and Makari Page for Michigan. I think they're both the weakest links in the starting secondary. Michigan does rotate players far more than Alabama does, and I don't really know why, because there is a pretty significant drop off between their backup players and their starting players. However, I do believe in my heart of hearts that Makari Page is just slightly better than Jalen Key, meaning that the position where I think there is actually the closest outcome, which is free safety, is ultimately going to decide who has the better secondary for the purposes of this video. And this is obviously Caleb Downs versus Rod Moore. And I do think this is more of a conversation than people are going to want to admit. Rod Moore is very, very good. I think he's a day 2 caliber safety who's very, very good at attacking downhill in the run game and is also very good as a center fielder in a cover 3 or in cover 4 where he's playing quarters. Where he kind of struggles a little bit is where they ask him to drop into coverage into either like a hook curl zone, or when he plays man coverage, he's not particularly good either. Caleb Downs is very, very good. However, he's a true freshman, and he does make a lot of true freshman sort of mistakes. He's far more inconsistent than Rod Moore. However, his ceiling is dramatically higher as he is a much, much better athlete and has much, much better ball skills than him. And because of the upside and the fact that he has gotten better from the beginning of the year till now, I believe that Caleb Downs is the better safety right now today. And because of that, I am going to say that Alabama does have a better group of defensive backs than Michigan does. So, to recap, I gave Alabama the advantage at the quarterback position, Michigan the advantage at the running back position, Alabama the advantage at the skill position, Alabama the advantage at the offensive line, Michigan the advantage along the defensive line, Michigan the advantage along the linebacking core, and Alabama along the defensive back groups. However, how good the running back is relative to the other team's running back or the defensive line is to the other team's defensive line does not particularly matter in any way at all. What matters is, are they better than who they're going up against? So we're going to look at the matchups here now. We're going to start with the Alabama offense versus the Michigan defense. So, as far as Jalen Milroe versus the Michigan defense as a whole, I'm actually going to give the advantage to the Michigan defense. I think there are things that Michigan can do defensively that nobody else that Alabama has played has been able to do. Michigan has the best pass rush that Alabama has played, in my opinion, and they have the second best group of defensive backs that they've played, in my opinion, as well. However, Alabama has not played, in my opinion, a team this year that can rush the passer like Michigan and play coverage like Michigan. They've played teams that can do those things individually, but not both of them at the same time. So because of that, I am going to give Michigan the slight advantage overall in terms of the Michigan defense versus the Alabama offense. However, I do think Alabama has a great borderline elite offensive line unit. And the fact remains that great offense beats elite defense, and elite offense is unstoppable. So even though I think Michigan has an elite caliber defensive line, Alabama has a great to elite caliber offensive line, meaning that they will win that matchup. And what does that mean for the game? Well, I think that Michigan is probably going to have to blitz in order to get pressure. And when you blitz, that opens up opportunities to throw the football, assuming the offensive line can hold up enough for Jalen Milroe to be able to do that. However, that's also assuming that there's somebody open to throw the ball to, which is where I think Michigan regains its advantage in this conversation. I think the Michigan secondary is more equipped to slow down the Alabama receivers than Georgia or anybody else that Alabama has played. Michigan has the caliber of defensive backs to be able to deal with this Alabama wide receiving and tight end core. Now, Jermaine Burton is gonna get open, and there will be opportunities for Jalen Milroe to complete passes. However, I don't think there's going to be as many of them in any game that Alabama has played so far this year. I.e., I think Alabama is going to have to work the ball down the field more than even they want to, meaning that I think the only real way they're going to be able to move the ball consistently on offense is through taking deep shots. And I think that Michigan will understand that and not allow Jalen Milroe to sit back there and read the field and throw the ball without much pressure getting into him like Georgia did in the SEC championship game. I think Michigan is going to blitz Georgia, and I think they have the talent to be able to cover on the back end enough so that they can get home in the pass rush department. Moving on to the Michigan offense versus the Alabama defense, and overall, I'm going to give the advantage to Alabama when it comes to Michigan's quarterback and by extension the offense versus Alabama's defense. I think that J.J. McCarthy is probably going to get hit more than he's ever gotten hit in his life in this game because Broswell and Turner are that good. However, if J.J. McCarthy is healthy and he can move around in the pocket and extend the plays, then there will be opportunities for him to throw the football down the field. However, I'm not positive that that's how this game is going to play out. Now, early on in this video, in the quarterback section, I said that Michigan's entire offense is predicated around the fact that the quarterback does not have to win the football game. And that is true. So even if JJ does get battered and bruised and there isn't necessarily the opportunities in the passing game, I'm not positive that that will make all that big of an impact on the outcome of this game. Because, as the next line down says, I think Michigan's offensive line is better than Alabama's defensive line and linebacking core. And I believe that Michigan will probably be able to run the ball fairly consistently, whether that's through the quarterback run game with Alex Orji or perhaps J.J. McCarthy, or even just the traditional run game up the middle. I think Michigan has the talent along the offensive line necessary to be able to do that. I don't think they have the talent to be able to run outside against these two very, very good edge rushers who are also very, very good at stopping the run. However, up the middle, Alabama's fairly vulnerable there. So I am going to give Michigan offensive line the ability to run the football, and I think that is what's going to matter far more than Michigan passing the football. And last and certainly least, the most obvious advantage slash disadvantage for anybody in maybe the history of college football, Michigan skill versus Alabama back seven. Alabama back seven dominates them. This isn't particularly a conversation to be had here. The final thing that I'm going to do before we talk about who I think is going to win this game is talk about the narratives surrounding this game. And the first and foremost narrative that it has been talked about a lot, at least in Michigan circles, I'm not sure if Alabama circles have talked about it, is the Vegas line. And if I was an Alabama fan, this would be the most terrifying thing that I have ever seen in my entire life. When the lines for the game got dropped, Michigan was a 2.5 point favorite. And that in and of itself is not all that unexpected. Michigan is ranked number 1, Alabama is ranked number 4, Michigan's been far more consistent, etc., etc. What is surprising is that according to Yahoo Sports, 93% of the bets over the first day of the betting line opening were on Alabama. And the line moved from 2.5 to 1.5, with Michigan still favored. And that is weird, tremendously strange, and kind of unbelievable even, that a line that is that lopsided would only move 1 point. And what that tells you is that Vegas actually thinks Michigan should be favored by far more than 2.5. Their models, for the most part, have Michigan favored by 7.5. However, the line of Michigan minus 7.5 is not enticing, because then everybody, literally like everybody, I don't think anybody would bet on Michigan to beat Alabama by more than 7.5 points. So that's not an enticing line. So they're going to lower it down to 2.5 to get you to bet on Alabama to cover and to probably win outright. Another thing that isn't perhaps being talked about a whole lot is the public does not particularly bet on games early. When you see people betting on games early, it's professional bettors. And those are the guys that actually dictate if the line moves or not. The public betting on it does not particularly matter at all. And for those of you that may be saying that the Vegas line and all of these numbers don't matter at all, that's absolutely absurd, because the exact opposite was true in Georgia versus Alabama. Almost 70% of the bets were on Georgia, and the line barely moved. Now, that line would not cause a movement like what 93% of the line ought to cause. However, that should still probably be a 2.5, 3-point swing. However, the line stayed the same. And Vegas won, because Vegas always wins. So if Vegas says Michigan should win this game and win by more than 1.5, despite 90%, I think actually now it's more like 85, 83%, despite the vast majority of professional bettors either way, and also probably the public thinking that Alabama is going to win, what Vegas looks at that and they see like the cartoon dollar signs entering up on their eyes, and they're like, oh man, we're going to make so much goddamn money doing this. Vegas does not make lines like this if they are not extraordinarily confident in it paying off for them. Next thing, which I think is actually far more important than the Vegas line, Michigan doesn't win bowl games. Just in the history of their program, they don't win bowl games, and they don't really win out-of-conference games either. Unless it's Notre Dame, but Notre Dame doesn't really count because they're not in a conference. So, yeah. And specifically, Jim Harbaugh has only won, I think, 2 bowl games his entire college football coaching career, and one was with Andrew Luck, where he was, like, clearly the better football team, and the other was Florida against a Florida team that had given up on life. So, I'm not sure that Michigan can win this game, simply because of the fact that in the history of Michigan football, they never win this game, or they very, very, very rarely win this game. The next narrative that is important, and we've talked about it quite a bit in this video, is the inconsistency of the Alabama offense. And that is going to be something that is a major determining factor in who wins this game. If Alabama can be as consistent as they were against Georgia, they're going to win this game easily. If the Alabama offense from the other 12 games this season shows up, then Michigan has a serious chance. Next up is the Michigan offense. And is it bad? The answer to that question is no. They've just played way better defenses than pretty much anybody in college football. And I'm going to walk you through it. According to NCAA.com, Penn State has the number 1 total defense, the number 3 pass defense, and the number 1 rushing defense. And they allow, on average, 233 yards per game. Michigan had 291. Ohio State, according to NCAA.com, again, has the number 3 total defense, the number 1 pass defense, and the number 22 rush defense. They allow 260 yards per game. Michigan had 340. Iowa has the number 5 total defense, the number 8 passing defense, and the number 13 rushing defense. They allow, on average, 274 yards per game. Michigan had 251 yards per game. However, that one has an asterisk on it, as Michigan was quite literally playing their 8th and 9th string wide receivers in the opening drive of the game. They did not give a fuck about Iowa. That is one of the most disrespectful things I've ever seen in my entire life. Peyton O'Leary was getting snaps on the opening drive of this game. That's how little they respected Iowa's offense. They said, we're going to play our 7th-string wide receiver who's not going to get open and have no impact whatsoever because we don't want our type guys to get hurt. Because that's what this game is. So, yeah, that was really interesting to see. Nebraska has the next highest defense that Michigan has played. They have the 13th total defense, the 44th pass defense, and the 7th rush defense. They allow, on average, 303 yards per game. Michigan had 436. So, of the 4 top 15 defenses that Michigan has played, they've exceeded what they normally give up in terms of yards in 3 of those 4 games, and in the 4th game, they didn't try. For what it's worth, Alabama would then have the next best defense that Michigan would be playing. They have the 18th total defense, the 23rd pass defense, and the 29th rushing defense, allowing 313 yards per game. Rutgers has the 19th total passing defense. They have the number 10 passing defense and the number 43 rushing defense, allowing on average 313 yards per game. Michigan had 415. Bowling Green would be the next defense. However, I'll give it to you if you don't think Bowling Green has a top 30 defense because they play in the MAC. I'll give you that one, okay? Bowling Green has the 28th overall defense, the 25th pass defense, and 42nd rush defense. They allow on average 329 yards per game, and Michigan got 315. Maryland is the next defense in terms of top 35 defenses that Michigan has played. They have the 34th total defense, the 40th passing defense, and the 33rd rushing defense. They allow on average 337 yards per game, and Michigan had 300. So Michigan has played significantly more high-quality defenses than Alabama, including 4 that are better than Alabama's. At least statistically, I think you can make the argument that Alabama has a better defense than Nebraska. However, I think that Ohio State, Penn State, and Iowa all have better defenses than Alabama this year. So if Michigan gets basically 300 yards per game, regardless of who they're playing, they'll play down a little bit if it's a worse defense, and they'll play up if it's an elite defense, then I think expecting Michigan to maybe just slightly exceed what Alabama normally gives up in terms of like yardage. If they get 350 yards, I think that would be a pretty expected outcome of that game. I think it would probably have to look like something like maybe 220 passing yards and 130 rushing yards. And I don't think that's an unrealistic expectation for this offense to have. In fact, I think the Michigan offense at this point is honestly a little bit underrated, not overrated. However, if you want to make the argument that the Michigan defense is overrated, or at least that their numbers are inflated a bit, then I can understand where that is coming from. Because the fact of the matter is that pretty much the only offense that they've played that I would put anywhere near elite is, in fact, Ohio State. However, stylistically, Ohio State did somewhat limit their offense a bit because they wanted to play the style of game where they ran the ball and played really, really good defense. But if they aired it out like they used to air it out, then I think they would have been just fine in terms of explosive plays and probably would have had a top 15 offense in the country. However, they didn't do that, even though I do think they were that good offensively. The next narrative that I would like to talk about here is turnovers and penalties. The fact of the matter is that Michigan is one of the best teams in the country at forcing turnovers, and they're one of the best, if not straight up the best team at not getting penalized. So Alabama is good at both of those things, but Michigan is elite, probably just straight up elite at both of those things. So I do think that is an advantage for Michigan. The fact of the matter is that I think the entire season they've only had 30 penalties called against them, and they hardly ever turn the ball over. I think they have like 5 or 6 turnovers the whole season as well. So Michigan does not beat themselves is the main point of that. And Alabama, while they don't do that either, they don't typically beat themselves. They do sometimes put the ball in precarious situations, and they do sometimes have a little bit of trouble with penalties. So that is a major narrative to watch inside the game. The last narrative I would like to talk about before I talk about who I think is going to win the game is going to be the fact that this is a game of mismatches. Alabama has several mismatches in their favor, and they're big ones. Michigan has several mismatches in their favor, and they're big ones as well. Alabama absolutely has an advantage when we're talking about edge rushers versus tackles. They have an advantage in the secondary, and if Jalen Milroe decides to take over the game with his legs, he'll probably be able to do that because he's a mismatch against everybody in the country. Michigan, on the other hand, does have the opportunity to potentially exploit some of this Alabama's defense by running the ball at their defensive tackles and potentially trying to somehow scheme their way up so that the linebackers are in man-to-man coverage against one of their great 2 tight ends. While defensively, they do rush the passer good enough to be able to put pressure on Jalen Milroe, where he is significantly worse than when kept clean, like beyond even the expected drop-off that you see when you're pressured. So when it's all said and done, these 2 teams, in terms of mismatches, are pretty even though there are great mismatches and big advantages to be gained for both teams. This is an extraordinarily close football game. I'm not sure who's going to win this game. I don't know. I've gone back and forth in this game probably just as much as Texas and Washington, and maybe even more so. But when it comes down to it, sometimes you have to put your balls on the table and hope that the sledgehammer doesn't come down. I am going to predict and go on record that Michigan is going to win this game by the score of 27-21. I think both of these teams are teams that like to limit the opposing team's possessions, and I think that greatly favors Michigan more than it does Alabama. And when it comes down to it, I think Michigan is going to find a way to be able to force a key turnover here or there and get a short field and steal a possession and some points. However, if you think Alabama is going to win, that is a perfectly reasonable position to have. I disagree, but what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. And it's at this point I'd like to ask you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagree with me at any point, or you just have something to say, go ahead and leave a comment down in the comment section below. And now, with the outro done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.